Hopefully, yes. I just think you now see my presentation. So for those who don't know and can't imagine why I've been asked, my name's Peter Parslow. I'm presenting to you from the south coast of England. Until 18 months ago, I was chair of ISO TC211, so I know quite a lot of you from that, and perhaps those, well, some of you will know me. And I've continued to lead the ongoing TC211 metadata project. So I was asked to give an update. Now, I might have understood the brief slightly wrong, because part of what I'm saying is you'll hear some of what was just said again, but from a slightly different perspective. So I was given this heading, where we're at. So I thought I'd have a look at what our geo people, our community, what are we currently using for metadata? And as we've just heard from North America, and that's the adjustment I made to say the North American profile is also a profile of the 2003 edition, generally encoded in XML. It's got its own standard there. That's the XML for that ISO metadata standard. And as we heard again, that's done across most of Europe, because that's what Inspire asked for back years ago when Inspire came out. And generally exchanged using a thing from OGC, commonly known as CSW, but interestingly, never a TC211 standard for that. But I know that in some countries, Australia, perhaps some others, they've moved to the 2014 edition, which had got a part 1 in its name by then. And its part 3 is its XML encoding, so kind of parallel to 19139. And that's had 2 editions, so there are 2 different XML encodings going around. All of this gives, so as our previous speakers had said, that the standards need to be accompanied by guidance. Just thought maybe I should also show myself. Don't know whether that's put a picture of me on your screens, probably in the wrong place. One of the things I used to say even before and as TC211 chair is actually that standards by themselves are useless, because you need guidance to make them interoperable, to make things actually work between the data sets or the metadata. And the best guidance is produced on the basis of experience by a given community, whether that's Canada or the oceanographic community or something. So carrying on, what are we currently using? There are a few people who've created custom JSON encodings because they don't like XML, or there's people who are taking either of them and translating them into DCAT, W3C standard. So that's got quite a traction in the UK with a flavor called GeoDCAT, which is a EU application profile of DCAT. So that's what we're busy doing in our community. But some years ago, probably 5 years ago in the UK, we ran some research talking to a bunch of people. So this is okay, only UK people. I'll come back to that in a minute. But what we found out as a result of that, the desk research, was that other people are publishing their metadata in this thing called DCAT or in schema.org. DCAT is a World Wide Web Consortium thing and encompasses lots of encodings. And schema.org is its own thing, widely used in web pages. But we found that what users actually do, however much effort we put into making sure our catalogs are good, nearly all users, including geospatial professionals, use Google. Okay, about 10% use a different search engine. But even the ones in the UK who started with a formal catalogue often couldn't find what they wanted, so they went to Google. Now, of course, that was 5 years ago. Now, actually, if they're using Google, that probably means there's a large language model, an AI doing the search for them and coming up with its own answers. But we can influence those answers, and that's another reason to push for schema.org or DCAT metadata, because it's more widely understood by those outside the geo community. So that's a sort of overview of where, as far as I'm aware, we, both our community and the world as a whole, are in terms of, this is looking at it not from the point of view of we're making a metadata for compliance, as the last speaker said, it's there for that people can find our data. This stuff's there for a purpose. It's not just to tick a legal requirement. So what's TC211 doing about that? We have 3 projects still in hand or just in hand. So first off the starting blocks was a project to produce a JSON encoding of the 115 Part 1 2014. And that's just about to be published. So it's with ISO for publication. They've sent a proof back to the editor. So after a possibly small number of rounds of corrections of tiny things, it'll go out. And that's actually a report. It isn't an ISO standard, but it's how a given tool was used to create a JSON encoding of a subset of 19115. And I think that'll be useful because not all, well, increasingly developers don't like having to handle XML. They prefer JSON. They like curly brackets instead of pointy ones or something like that. There are better reasons too. What we have realized as well, sorry, going back and thinking, you've just heard a good story about how come Canada is still working on adopting what's basically the 20-plus-year-old edition, while ISO has got a more recent one, and Europe's doing the same. So we're well aware that it takes a long time to adopt newer things. So we know that this technical report will go out. Some places might use it. I suspect the Netherlands might, because they've been quite instrumental in producing it. Another thing, so one of the 2 projects I'm leading is to look at what happens if you want to get a DCAT record, a DCAT version of your ISO record. So I see a question from Giz, which I'll come back to, or perhaps reference somebody else to answer. No, actually, let's pause because Liz's question relates to that last slide. What are the key benefits of encoding with JSON? Liz, as an old-fashioned programmer, I've asked that question quite often and not got answers that make me happy. They appear to sit in the lines of, well, that's what most developers want now. But you might find more younger developers who can give better answers because they've actually paid more attention to it, because I'd stopped being a developer by the time the argument or the question was going along. So that's in a sense Liz saying, I'm sorry, I don't have a good answer to what are the key benefits of encoding with JSON. Do we have evidence of where it's consumed? So I would ask if there's anyone from the Netherlands around to give an answer to that. Paul Paul Jensen's the one who's leading that project. There are plenty of other Netherlands people who might be able to say where they've got that from. So that's not one of my projects. One of the ones I'm leading is this DCAT one. Sorry, Liz. Move on. The mapping from 115 to DCAT got a big push from the European side because the European Commission ended up with too many European Commission dates at the start of that. But they came up with this GeoDCAT, so the geospatial subset of DCAT. It's an application profile of DCAT. So that's worth a little look. DCAT is a grammar. It's just a collection of terms saying, if you want to publish a title, call it a title, that kind of thing. But an application profile does, so it says, okay, if you're describing a data set, you shall have a title. You shall have what we in ISO call an abstract, and they call a description. So it's the bit that provides cardinality, if you like, to the properties that a class should have, rather than just being a grammar. And the European Commission started to push for that, saying all what they call high-value data sets, which includes many geospatial data sets, should be published with that as their metadata. So the countries all started doing it separately. The European Commission came up with its mapping, and then there was interest from other countries to say, can we have an international version of that mapping? So this project was originally really started saying, okay, let's look at the European GeoDCAT and internationalize it, which had a parallel project in OGC that seems to have gone dormant but might come back. So we put out a committee draft January this year. We've just about finished working our way through rather a lot of comments. We've made enough changes. We'll have to go out for a second committee draft. And this actually, I think, is a good collaborative way of making a good document. So, for example, we've brought in more North American requirements and profile from actually the US National Archive Records Administration. So their guidelines as to what you have to have for metadata has added in some extra mappings. So that's our DCAT mapping. So there will be a officially public review later in this year, but the committee draft reviews go to a very wide variety of geospatial people. It's all those who are engaged with TC211 either as national bodies or as liaison organisations. So there'll be another round chance to engage with that. We're hoping for not getting so many comments this time, but it's better to have the comments and fix them than to have people say, well, that's no good, I can't use it. The other project that's underway at the moment is a revision of the Part 1. So when I say 10 plus years in use, that's since the 2014 edition. Obviously, well over 20 years in use from the 2003 edition. So 115 remains the best seller, if you like, in the TC211 space. So we've got a number of changes been asked for over the years that we're planning to bring in, as well as an update, because the way TC211 uses UML has changed, and in particular has pulled out the code lists, which are a bit hidden in a rather old standard. So this is a domain set of values you can have for a property. Those are now published on the web in what I call a web-friendly way. We've also, the thing will be much more formal, so there'll be identifiable requirements grouped together in requirement classes rather than just a lot of words that say shall every now and then. We've also been asked to consider a multi-dimensional bounding box by some domains, and so we'll expect to include one of them to get better at the way we have license information. So the way people think about how they license data when they share it has changed over the last 20-something years. So it's no longer just you separately state what constraints and restrictions you want to place. You tend to have a formal license and connect to that. So expect that one as a public review later in this year. So a committee draft before it, hopefully during what in the Northern Hemisphere we'll call the summer. But that one won't change. So the DCAT one is a completely new document. So there's a lot of change, obviously, because you're starting from nothing. Whereas this is a revision, so it's not a huge amount of change. But we're well aware that, I'm going to say half the world, that's obviously an exaggeration, a lot of countries are not yet migrated from the 2003, and that there's quite a push to migrate not to a new edition of 115, but actually to DCAT. Hence the priority being to get that DCAT mapping out first, even if it then needs an update when this is updated. So there's those 3 projects going on, and I'll just have a side look at these web-friendly code sets, as I've called them. So GML dictionary files were something I suppose we thought would take off 20-something years ago, and perhaps had a little bit of popularity, but not long. So now you can go, for example, to def-isotc11.org's common progress code, and you'll find you can get back SCOS, so web ontology, or a variety of other responses. But basically, there's a canonical URI for each value, and those are much more of a web way of encoding anything. So whatever encoding you're using for your metadata, you can reference the same domain value, and of course other domains have their own coded values with the same technology. So we could be able to get much more consistency. And what's really useful with these things, in my view, is that they're much more amenable to machine language reading rather than having everything written just in text, let alone hidden inside a downloadable XML file. So this is where we're at, and I think it ends effectively 2 questions. Do these things mean that we, the TC211 effectively, but the spatial standards community, because OGC are engaged with this, are we, in this sense, preparing our metadata for the future? Will this result in our data sets being more discoverable because the metadata is more amenable to being processed by machines rather than humans? So for a long time, I suppose, we've thought that there'll be a future where computers are doing a lot of our searching for us. Now they are, but they're having to do a lot of heavy lifting by sorting through text that's written for people to read and full of ambiguities for that reason. And so by making that text more rigorous, by having well-defined terms stored in registers, we're hoping that the metadata will be less ambiguous and the chances of actually getting the right result from a AI search should improve. Now that's all very futuristic when we're still mostly using a standard that's 20 years ago. But we can find sort of hybrid ways to do that and pick some parts of the new to use with the old. I strongly expect most publishers will continue to maintain the metadata with a 19115 model, so most geospatial publishers, because that's actually a far richer model. When we map to DCAT, we have to lose a lot of things that professional users of our data want to know, so they need to be able to reference back to the original record, which if it's a very well-populated record can have a lot about data quality, which is loosely defined in DCAT, as an example. So that's what I hope was expected from me, and that's me for now.